Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Claude Grunitzky, and I wanted to welcome you to the final edition of our webinar series for 2022. This is the final one. And first off, I wanted to apologize for all the back and forth. President Yayi was supposed to be with us today, and then he wasn't feeling too well, and then we were going to postpone it. And in the end, we made a decision amongst the teams here at True Africa University at MIT Center for International Studies that we would go ahead, and quite frankly, I would go ahead and present. And the reason I wanted to present is because I have a lot to say. We started this series in March of 2021, and in March of 2021, we had 11 different weekly webinars. We had started with the film The Great Green Wall, which I executive produced. And we talked about sustainable development issues, specifically around the Great Green Wall. And then we ended up broadening it to various aspects of sustainable development for Africa. And the reason I wanted to wrap it up today with my own vision of the future is because I realized that Africa is at a crossroads in this pandemic or post-pandemic period that we're in. The reality is that if we just look at the numbers, 60% of the African population is under the age of 25. However, one of the reasons I created True Africa University and was able to get the support of MIT is because Africa is missing an opportunity to tap into its young talent. It's the youngest continent, but it's also, unfortunately, the poorest continent. If we consider the fact that Nigeria right now is a country where more children are born in Nigeria every year than the entire European Union of 27 countries, then Nigeria by the year 2100 is going to have a population of about 1.1 billion, which is going to put it pretty much at the same size as India. And Nigeria will be, alongside India, the most populated country in the world. We realize that we have to find actionable ways to nurture Africa's talent, and specifically Africa's young talent. And this is more urgent than ever. And just to kind of give you a bit of the background on why I've been convening you and everyone else that is interested in Africa and sustainable Africa for the past year on these Thursday sessions is because, I created True Africa University as a Pan-African learning community. And I always said that I would be committed and my team would be committed, and our whole entire philosophy would be around accelerating Africa's sustainable development by mobilizing a global network of academic, institutional, and industrial partners. So that's really important to me. And again, I want to thank the team at MIT for the support since day one. I do want to frame this conversation today around what President Yayi and I were supposed to talk about. And we were supposed to talk about Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 is a program that is very much driven by inspiration and very much driven by lived experience. And it was created and actually presented in 2013, where President Yayi was also the president of the African Union. And it was looking 50 years into the future and trying to imagine what Africa could achieve in those 50 years. And out of that Agenda 2063 came a hashtag that has become quite popular. I've been using that hashtag for the past decade nearly, and it's the AfricaWeWant. And so today's webinar is really framed around a discussion around the Africa we want. And this is my vision for Africa's future. And I will start with a few of the learnings from the previous webinars, the 6 webinars that we had over the past 6 weeks. And I want to start there and give you some of the key takeaways that I was able to extract from those conversations I had with these various leaders and experts and policymakers and entrepreneurs and doers from all over Africa. And this year we had great gender parity. We had also great representation of various regions of Africa, from east to west to southern Africa. So without further ado, I want to thank you for bearing with us while we went back and forth on the scheduling. And I would like to give you my point of view on this Africa we want dream, I'll call it. That'll be for the next maybe 20 minutes. And then after that, I would really love to open it up to questions, because I would love to have a dialogue with you around some of the key issues around sustainable development in Africa. Again, before we move forward, I want to thank the team at MIT Center for International Studies, Ari's team at MIT Africa, the MISTI program, and again, everybody at True Africa University. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. And yeah, I'm going to share because I have a lot to say. So the first thing I'll say is the Africa We Want is a hashtag that has become popular with people like myself who are Africans in the diaspora, but also Africans living on the continent, because it encapsulates a lot of different policies and ideas that are coalescing around what we've noticed was a lot of the bad choices that were made by decision makers across Africa, whether they're coming from the political sphere or the economic sphere or even the social sphere. So again, I'm Claude Grunitzky. I'm the founder of True Africa University. I'm also a research affiliate at the MIT Center for International Studies. And I will start with what I remember and what I took away from the past 6 weeks and the 6 webinars that we had with these different speakers. So we started on the 3rd of March with David Moyne. And David is a bit of a legend in the MIT community because, or certainly in the MIT Africa community, because he is one of those people who have constantly been looking for solutions to some of Africa's biggest problems, but he does it on a very localized level. And when I met him at MIT back about a decade ago, he was finishing his PhD at the Media Lab. And after he finished his PhD, he got all kinds of job offers from Google and many of the big tech companies that are now dominating the world's economy. And he turned many of them down. He ended up working for IBM for a little bit on the in Africa, and then he was appointed Minister of Education, of Basic Education in his home country of Sierra Leone. So those of us who know David, we love David, and David's also a musician. But what I really loved about the way he presented his vision for education in Sierra Leone was the fact that he really made it extremely inclusive, and he's trying to leave no one behind, no child behind. And so this is what he shared with us as his approach to EdTech. So educational technology for him is using all the tools and all the platforms, all the channels that one can find in order to create a hybrid model for continuous learning and teaching. So in Sierra Leone, he has pretty much changed the way that children and teenagers learn because he's using radio, he's using television, he's using print and tangible media. He's obviously using the mobile platforms that are really popular in Africa right now, and using that into an EdTech approach, which is all about continuous learning and professional development. So lifelong learning, home, in the community, at school, he's finding ways to spread that knowledge to all kinds of different platforms and new ways of learning. And what was really encouraging about the way that David Senge spoke about the reforms that are underway in Sierra Leone now is that he's been getting a lot of partners. He's been getting a lot of institutional partners, and he's been getting a lot of people supporting this new evidence-based way of teaching children and teenagers in Sierra Leone. So that was really encouraging when we look at some of the challenges that policymakers are facing in the education sphere. Obviously, education is my core priority, and we went deeper into, what Africa could achieve. And I want to remind you that all the webinars are available on the MIT Center for International Studies YouTube page and also on the trueafricauniversity.com website. So if you want to go back and watch that, I think it might be a really good idea to hear from someone like David Senge, who's a product of the MIT environment, who really is a product of Sierra Leone, post-Civil War Sierra Leone, and who's actually working very closely with the president of Sierra Leone to find real solutions to the education conundrum in his country in West Africa. So on that, a week later, on the 10th of March, I spoke with Minister Sina Lawson, who is the Minister of Digital Economy in my home country, Togo. And we went really, really deep into what Togo is doing right now to transform its economy by using some of the tools of technology that are now available as well. So that was really building and dovetailing on what David talked about in Sierra Leone, but we had a different approach from a francophone country, not too far from Sierra Leone, but is also very small, which is great for piloting kind of some more daring initiatives. So Sina, Lawson, and I, we talked about Togo's 2025 strategy. So this isn't going all the way to 2063. This was about some of the specific programs that are going to hopefully help citizens, regular citizens, to participate in this economy that's being transformed. Sina Lawson and I talked about, some of the things that are working, and she was really honest about some of the things that are not working quite as well. One of the things that I found really interesting is this national biometric identification attribution of a unique identification number. So basically, she's working towards having each citizen having an electronic ID, which will make things like voting a lot easier, which will make things like having access to basic public services a lot easier, and which will also help with the universal basic income schemes like the one that Togo actually implemented during the pandemic with this Novisi program. She's working on access to broadband and equipment for all. Actually, Equiano was just announced last couple of weeks, and it's Google's major initiative for providing major connectivity throughout Africa, and Togo is actually the hub for this Google initiative called Equiano. So that was a major victory for Sina as a Minister of Digital Transformation, Digital Economy in Togo. But what does it actually mean for regular citizens? It means that it's digitizing public services, it's access to basic social services, and basically eliminating the paper chase, which is really what the bureaucracy that we notice in these countries such as Togo, end up kind of holding a lot of people back. So she's creating an environment where it's all about innovation and digital talents and identifying individual talents who can be the key participants in this transformation of the economy. So that was really encouraging as well. And I was able to talk with her about some of the changes I saw in my own home country. The following week, we went, virtually to South Africa and spoke with Tabi Leoka, who is a very accomplished economist working with the private sector and the public sector in Johannesburg. And she's talked about, she got a PhD at the London School of Economics, and she's very much rooted in some of the kind of new theories of development that are very much rooted in failed experiences in Africa and how we can actually learn and do better. And she talked specifically about what she's seeing as some of the key challenges across the continent. And one of the topics that she ended up elaborating on is a topic of access to electricity. And this is a slide from her presentation. And what I found really, in a way, kind of depressing about this presentation, if we look at these three graphs here, the one on the left is looking at the big burners, right? And that is the top 5 coal-intensive G20 countries. And this is numbers from right at the beginning of the pandemic, so this is 2020. And if we look at South Africa, for instance, you realize that close to 73% of the energy supply is coming from coal. And this is even more than a country like China, which is getting around 60% of its energy from coal. So this is extremely problematic because South Africa is, along with Nigeria and Egypt, the most developed country in Africa. And if you look at how much coal is being burned, and if you look at the fact that oil is another 10% of the energy supply, and if you look at renewables as just a tiny little slice of the current energy supply for a country like South Africa, you realize that we've got a long way to go in order to provide clean energy for citizens in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. So the map in the middle is showing the the proportion of the population, this is 2019 data, that actually has access to electricity in Africa. And so if you look at South Africa, which again is one of the most developed countries, you'll see that maybe 94% of the South African population has access to electricity. And that's encouraging, right? You have countries in the north of Africa, Egypt, you have Morocco, Algeria, where it's actually over 99%. But if you look at, say, my country, Togo, right there, we're sitting about around 40%. So not even half of the population has access to electricity. Now, you could say that there's progress, because when I was a child growing up in Togo in the 1970s and 80s, then maybe it was maybe only 10% of the population. So we've gone from 10 to say 40%, but there's still a long way to go in order to provide electricity for those 60% of the Togolese population who do not have access to electricity. And we have reason to believe, and many of us at MIT and elsewhere have reason to believe that renewable energy could be a solution, and specifically if we look at how shaky the energy markets have become as a result of this war in Ukraine. So I thought it was really important to focus on something like that, because electricity is very much connected to connectivity and to basically industrial growth, pretty much everything that the economy needs in order to grow. So I felt that was an important discussion to have. And there were actually a few questions in the webinar that week around specifically electricity and clean energy. So we can't talk about sustainable development if we don't figure out the energy solution. And this is something that Professor Jeffrey Sachs also talked about in his webinar, the one that we did in April of 2021. So the following week, we went back into the world of education, again, starting with primary schools with Noella Corsaros Musunka. And she talked about her school that she started, and that school is called Maleka. And, to give you a bit of background for those who were not able to watch that webinar, to participate in any sort of way, again, this is all available on YouTube, on the MIT Center for International Studies YouTube page, and on the trueafricauniversity.com website. Noella was a working top model. She was basically living a life of privilege, having grown up quite underprivileged in her home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as opposed to being in the category of people who always talk about what they're going to do for their home country and for the communities back home, but never actually do anything, she actually 15 years ago went and set up a school in the DRC. And I remember when she was talking about it, and within a year she'd actually done it, and she managed to secure some funding to open the school. And what I found really interesting about her, very much grassroots way of dealing with education at the primary level for mostly girls in Lubumbashi, is that she chose education because she realized that it's at the root of everything. It's similar to what David Senge talked about in the first webinar with respect to Sierra Leone. The quote that she gave us from Nelson Mandela is one of the most quoted sentences that I've heard, but I think it's important to remind everybody what Mandela said. Education is the greatest weapon with which we can change the world. And these numbers are just really, quite frankly, kind of jarring. Like 7 million children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo do not currently attend school. What does that mean? Is that a lot of these girls that you see in this picture, they end up becoming teenage mothers. And that comes with its own challenges throughout life. I'm very well placed to know that, because that's the story of my mom. So I know what that means for the life choices that you end up making if you do not have access to education, starting with primary school. So if you look around the world and you realize that 262 million children and teenagers in the world are currently out of school, that's really a real problem. And so the fact that Noella has been able to, again, establish institutional partnerships and has been able to attract regular donors. She introduced me a few months ago to a donor who was a high school student in Texas, in Austin, Texas, who basically had been contributing her birthday money to help to fund scholarships for girls in the Maleka schools in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And if we look at just kind of everyday citizens and the work that they can do individually, And we couple that with the work that institutions, that are at the World Bank level, United Nations level, can actually do to help more girls to attend school in sub-Saharan Africa. We can totally imagine a different trajectory for Africa. The trajectory could be very much about what I've been calling and what the African Union has been pushing around the Africa we want. So that was a very important webinar on the topic of education. And we stayed in that lane for the webinar that we had with Paris Niabosire, who is a young Kenyan entrepreneur who I had actually met at the Innovation Prize for Africa about 5 years ago in Accra, in Ghana. And she was there to collect a prize for her startup that she had created in Nairobi. And the startup is called Farm Drive. And it's all about helping smallholder farmers to gain some sort of freedom through specific services that are data-driven. And so the interesting thing about Paris is that even though she's a young entrepreneur and a successful young entrepreneur who's attracted a top quality team, a great co-founder, and investors from around the world, she actually came to MIT in September, and she's currently completing her MBA at the MIT Sloan School of Management, which I graduated from as a Sloan Fellow, and she felt that she had a lot to learn. That's one of the reasons I came to MIT, even though I'd already been a successful entrepreneur. I came because I still had a lot to learn about systems thinking and scaling in the right way, in the most sustainable way. So Paris shared her story with Farm Drive. And for those of you who are not familiar with Farm Drive, it's basically what she calls data-driven technology for smallholder farmers in Africa. So what she provides is alternative credit scoring. So finding ways to determine who is credit worthy among those smallholder farmers. And she talked about what she looks at to determine who's credit worthy and who's not. And then from there, she and her team provide targeted loan products to these smallholder farmers. So these products are specifically designed with financial inclusion in mind, and they also are designed to take into consideration a lot of the smallholder cash flow cycles, which are very non-traditional. So it's not the traditional approach, which is all about micro loans and micro lending, which was made popular, in Bangladesh and elsewhere by Professor Mohammed Yunus and others. This is really much more data-driven and less kind of just a basic behavioral thinking in decision-making around providing loan products to people who actually need the money in order to grow their farms. She also talked a little bit about some of the analytical tools that she uses in order to collect the data for recovery. So sometimes people don't pay those loans back, and so there's different methods that are used for collections and what she's been calling customer retention, which is a much more positive way of framing it. So I was really, again, really inspired by the way that Paris spoke about what she sees as a young entrepreneur who was raised in a very kind of simple household, but always had this dream of helping to transform Africa. And it was extremely encouraging to me to see that Farm Drive is growing and that she's going to be acquiring new skills at MIT to be able to get to the next level. And then last week, we had a really interesting discussion with Marie-Cécile Sansou, who is, I'll just call her a cultural entrepreneur. She's also from Benin, and we were kind of building up from Marie-Cécile Sansou up to President Yayi, who was the president of Benin from 2006 to 2016. But Marie-Cécile Sansou talked about her own initiative in Benin. She's French and Beninese, so she's a dual citizen. And she created in Cotonou and then also in Ouida, which is another town in Benin, close to the border of Togo, where I'm from, a foundation called the Fondation Sansou. She started this 17 years ago. She's now got 3 spaces, 3 different museums, and they've had 42 exhibitions and 7 million visitors. And it is the very first museum of contemporary art in Africa. But what I found really interesting about Marie-Cécile's approach is the fact that she has again partnered with schools to provide cultural access to the museum to school children who get to go to the museum and discover the works of great artists from Benin, from the rest of Africa, and also from countries such as the United States, because she showed images of a Keith Haring exhibition, which a lot of kids found quite interesting, even though some of them didn't actually like the work of Keith Haring, the street artist, the very famous street artist. So that was really interesting as a segue into talking about the potential for sustainable development in Africa from a cultural perspective, and how Africa can become a major cultural force. It is already becoming a major cultural force, even outside of the well-known and well-documented progress that is being made in Nigeria with the Nollywood films, or also coming out of Nigeria with some of the Afro beats music that is now very, very popular around Africa and around the world. So that was the last 6 weeks. And now I want to share with you what President Yayi and I were going to talk about. And this is the topic that we had kind of agreed on. And I want to share with you, a little bit more insights on this Agenda 2063 and how important it is for Africa, certainly as a vision for the future. So Agenda 2063, which President Yayi worked on when he was the chair of the African Union in 2012 and 2013, is Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. Now that sounds like a huge statement, right? Oh, for Africa, the global powerhouse of the future? Well, yes, it is possible because, as I said earlier, Africa is the youngest continent. And it's a strategic framework that aims to deliver on its goal for inclusive and sustainable development. Again, the key word here that we've been kind of using since last year, because this is really what defines what we do. Its goal for inclusive and sustainable development, and is a concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity that is pursued under Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. So that mission, that vision, those values, that is very much why I decided to create True Africa University, and why I believe that this Agenda 2063 and the AfricaWeWant hashtag are extremely important for the way that we can look at African issues and chart a new course for sustainable development. So it's looking at children such as this one, these ones are here, that boy and that girl, and it's looking at what kind of world we together can build or help build for them. So the need here is to envision a long-term 50-year development trajectory for Africa. And this is important because Africa needs to revise and adapt its development agenda due to ongoing structural transformations. And when I say revise and adapt, I go back to what I said earlier around the fact that, we realize that there have been a lot of bad choices made in education, in healthcare, in energy, all across the board, and that it's time for a new vision. And what does it actually mean? It means increased peace and reduction in the number of conflicts in Africa. It means renewed economic growth and social progress. It means the need for people-centered development. And that's really important, putting people at the center of development, as opposed to just treating citizens as kind of bystanders in the strive for growth. This is really important. And this is something that we see in the mining field and other fields as well. It means pushing for gender equality and youth empowerment, which is really important. I've talked about it, but I feel like we need to keep talking about it. It means changing global context with increased globalization in mind, and looking at the power of technology and the revolution around information and communication technology. So it's a little bit about the work that Sina Lawson is doing in Togo. It's a little bit about the work that David Senge is pushing in the drafting of the curriculum in Sierra Leone, but it's really looking at all kinds of industries that could be transformed with the internet, the power of connectivity, and everything else that will allow a more inclusive society, because many Africans now have access to the smartphones, and even though there's still a lot of feature phones in many parts of Africa, the rapid growth of smartphone adoption is something that is a huge opportunity in this world, this globalized world that we're living in. The other point was the increased unity of Africa, which makes it a global power. And I say unity of Africa because one of the things that we discussed in the webinar with Tabi Leoka, the South African economist I mentioned earlier, is the fact that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a huge opportunity for Africa. It's pushing for basically getting rid of some borders across Africa, certainly from a trade perspective and from a free movement of people and goods across the continent. And that is something that was ratified by 53 of the 55 African countries. And it's something that is a major priority for a lot of the governments in Africa at the moment. And this increased unity of Africa is something that is at the root of the Pan-African vision of Agenda 2063. And this means that the African Union needs to chart a common agenda for all of those nations. What does that actually lead to? It leads to new development and investment opportunities in areas such as agribusiness, infrastructure development, health and education, as well as the value addition in African commodities, which are often shipped and exported without any sort of transformation or industrial output. So that's pretty much the broader vision. And I wanted to now kind of transition to what I'm doing, because I don't believe in just talking, as I said, I believe in doing. So what I'm doing is I'm doing True Africa University. And why am I doing True Africa University? It's because I believe in this vision and I believe in a brighter future for Africa. And I want to be one of those key participants, one of the people who actually do and not just talk. And to give you an example of some of the things we've been doing in addition to this webinar series, last summer, we created a 6-week course on an introductory course on an African perspective on climate change. And it was a really interesting course because we talked about the fundamentals of climate change from an African perspective. We talked about the people and communities in the face of nature from an African perspective. And we talked about how is climate change impacting women in Africa. We talked about regenerating African ecosystems. This is obviously an issue if you look at desertification and some of the issues that Africans are facing in the Sahel and other places. That was the topic of the film that I mentioned earlier, The Great Green Wall that I produced, regenerating African ecosystems. We talked about the green economy because yes, Africa could have its own green economy, which is about showcasing a few African success stories and people who are doing great work in the space of renewable energy that I mentioned, people who are doing great work in across the reclamation of land. And I think that there's a lot more that can be done to create a proper sustainable green economy across the African continent. And we saw it in Ethiopia. If you watch my film, The Great Green Wall, you'll see that Ethiopia, which was a country that was known for famine and its own agriculture being completely decimated in the 1980s, has been reborn as an important agricultural force in East Africa, and that is also a great exporter of many agricultural goods. And then we ended up kind of just looking at the models for development, which sustainable development model is actually suitable and sustainable for Africa. So we talked about that, and it was a great course. We're preparing the second one now. And what was interesting about the course, which is our inaugural course, is that we got to work specifically on these optics of sustainable development and climate change from an African perspective with 55 students from 20 African countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, Cameroon, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Somalia, Sudan, Tanzania, South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, and Tunisia. And we got to work with them and we got to get them to participate in this program and feel that they're part of a cohort that does have a common passion, which is tackling climate change. So that's what I'm doing. And we're going to be scaling pretty quickly. We are working on a 1-year master's in sustainable development with a couple of partners on the African continent and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network that is headed by Jeffrey Sachs. we're also working on other 6-week courses in the style of this inaugural course that I mentioned on an African perspective on climate change. And we're just at the beginning of our journey. So with that, I wanted to thank you. And I got ahead of myself by sharing my 3 favorite books, which is always the last question that I ask when I'm about to wrap up. So I'm going to now stop sharing and open it up to questions, because there's a lot that I want to discuss with you, and I would love your opinions. So looking at the questions now, and I'm going to take a question from Nicole Kumbula. Now, please, I'm hoping to take a few more questions in the 10 minutes that we have left, but I'll start with the first of question from Nicole Kumbula. I'm going to just read it out loud now. And essentially, Nicole says, thank you for the series. My name is Nicole. I am a master's student based in Texas and a Zimbabwean social entrepreneur. My comment for everyone in attendance today: I've noticed that the bystander mentality is impacting the diaspora. We are waiting for the right big vision with very big grants. I want to challenge us all as someone who won a $2,500 grant for social ventures. With $200, we are rearing 75 hens for food and youth empowerment education. What are you doing today with your resources? Well, first off, I want to thank you, Nicole, for doing that, right? With rearing the 75 hens and really just looking at using your grant to do something specific on the African continent. And you define yourself as a social entrepreneur, and I have a lot of respect for social entrepreneurs. I work very closely with social entrepreneurs. I myself consider myself to be a social entrepreneur in some aspects. And I think it's important. And I want to go back to the issue of grants, actually, to be really honest. One of the things that I noticed as somebody who's been doing a lot of work in Africa, over the last decade, I've met many social entrepreneurs who are just waiting for grants. They are waiting for grants, they're applying for grants, and they basically, in some aspects, are kind of waiting for handouts. And that's problematic. And I say that as somebody who created my own youth entrepreneurship program in Togo. It's called the Forum for Young Entrepreneurs. And it's a startup competition where we give grants to the best and most innovative ideas coming from the tech world in Togo. And to be honest, a few of the grant winners, I noticed like 5 years on, 6 years on, that they're still applying for grants as opposed to looking to build actual sustainable models for their businesses, because there's been this mentality that the only way that young Africans and Africans can actually access financing is by getting grants, right? Grants from USAID, grants from various aid organizations, various development agencies, development partners, or whatever we call them. And I find that sometimes in the social entrepreneur mindset that I encounter in Togo, but also in other countries where I've worked across Africa, mainly as part of Barack Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative, I noticed that this mentality, which is around securing a grant just to get started, doesn't actually evolve into any sort of sustainable business model mentality where you're actually creating conditions where you can have income from a regular, by having identified a business model that is that will allow you to wean yourself off of those grants after you've got the grants to get started. And this is something that I keep telling the young social entrepreneurs, that the grants are just there to help you to get a foot in the door, but it should not be the only thing that you apply for and that you rely on for your funding. Now, of course, a lot of organizations are set up as nonprofits, and there's a logic to securing grants and so on, and that's obviously important. But there's also new models that are emerging now around hybrid models where you can actually create revenue generating activities in order to be less dependent on grants. So that is a really important contribution and a really important question, and I want to thank you, Nicole, for bringing that up as a social entrepreneur from Zimbabwe. Now, I want to transition to a second question from Thomas Kisimbi. And he's asking me about James Robinson's framework on Africa's latent talents. And it's very interesting that he mentioned that, because that paper has actually created quite a buzz in the circles that I move in. And it has to do with the lack of actual social mobility in Africa, and the fact that, you know, many Africans are actually thinking about social mobility in the wrong way, and it's approaching this topic of around Africa's latent talents, assets, around how do we actually make the most of the talent that is all over Africa, and that could actually help to grow the continent if it's actually mobilized in the right way. And what I would say to that is that I want to take you back to a study that I actually can refer to, because part of it was extracted from the work that I did with young entrepreneurs in Togo. And it's all about working on mindsets for specifically the entrepreneurial community, working on personal initiative, as opposed to teaching people the traditional curriculum that is meant to solve some of Africa's problems. A lot of the things that are holding Africans back is the fact that sometimes they're lacking the personal initiative to actually get started, because they feel that the odds are stacked against them. So I will share a link to that report, which again, I'm very familiar with, because it's called New Mindsets, Increased Profits, Lessons from an Innovative Entrepreneurial Training in Togo, which is again, very linked to the work that I've been doing in Togo since 2013 as part of the Young African, as part of my investment in African youth. I'm sharing it here so that you can see it. And I would say that that would be my answer to that question around some of Africa's Latin assets and making the most of the youth in Africa. There's a final question that I wanted to tap into before I get to my 3 books, and that question is from Kadi Sila. Kadi said, Claude mentioned a 2060 goal for Africa-focused development. Why the 2060 as opposed to 2050 as an SDGs? Kadi, the answer is it's actually 2063, and it's basically taking Africa forward into the future, 50 years into the future. And the only reason it's 2063 is because the African Union put out this Agenda 2063 in 2013. So it is very much linked to some of the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals that are, again, all about 2050. So thank you so much, Kadi, for pointing that out. I'm really happy that you brought that up, and it makes sense for all of these agendas and broader goals to be in sync, as opposed to having different organizations working in silos. So I want to again thank you for these questions. And now I'm going to go back to my own 3 books. So this is a question I ask each one of my guests at the end of our webinars. I always ask them which 3 books they would recommend to the audience, and I get different answers. So now, for the first time, I will share with you my 3 books, the books that have really had a huge impact on me. And I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and it is this page here. So the 3 books that I wanted to talk about are, I guess, my all-time favorite book, which is Candide by Voltaire. It's an absolute classic. Many people know this book. It's a very important book. It's been discussed pretty much for centuries. And Candide is, how should I summarize that book, which I read when I was a teenager? Candide is it was published in 1759, and we could just call it a satirical, philosophical essay. And it begins with a protagonist called Candide, who's a young man who's living this life in this kind of paradise. And then he's being indoctrinized by his mentor, Professor Spanglos, and his idyllic life is actually brought to reality, and he deals with a set of setbacks which lead to disillusionment. But what I like about that book and why it's shaped my thinking throughout my entire adult life is because it is very much about optimism and finding ways to overcome adversity. The second book that I would like to recommend is a book that I actually read when I was a student at MIT and ended up totally changing my approach to decision making. It's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's a very famous book. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics. That book was actually recommended by my co-founder at True Africa University, François-Xavier, and it ended up changing the way that I look at decision thinking, because thinking fast is very different from thinking slow. And the whole book is about how you make certain decisions immediately and on instinct, and how certain decisions need to be thought through. The final book that I wanted to recommend is a book that I read when I was 20 years old, and it's called The Famished Road. It was written by Ben Okri, who won the Booker Prize for that book. It's a novel, and I read it, and a year later, I got to meet the author, Ben Okri, who was my neighbor when I was living in the little Venice neighborhood in London. And The Famished Road is really the story of a child who's able to see the world through our reality, but he's also able to see the world of spirit simultaneously. And it's a fantastic novel that is rooted in West African kind of oral history and storytelling, because it's about living with our ghosts, living with our ancestors, and being aware that we are what we are because we are fed and informed and driven by the spirit of our ancestors. So as I wrap up and talk about the future of Africa and Africa We Want, I want to thank you all for participating in the 7-week webinar series. I want to thank everybody at the MIT Center for International Studies, John Tierman, Michelle English, Laura Kerwin, Dick Samuels, pretty much the entire team. I want to thank François-Xavier and my team at True Africa University. And I really am so grateful that you were able to give me 15 minutes of your time for 7 consecutive weeks. And I hope to see you again next year in 2023. Thank you so much for participating. It's been a blessing to be with you. Bye, everyone.